Okay, so I'm going to start back at the beginning so you can maybe edit out a lot of that
Yeah.
technical glitch. So why am I talking about prana today? Essentially, it's because you cannot understand Kundalini without first understanding prana. It's that important. And there are two basic tenets of the Indian spiritual tradition that will have to be incorporated into modern science before it will really be able to really properly understand Kundalini. The existence of prana is one of them, and the other one is the tenet that consciousness is a higher order of a reality than the physical that we perceive with our senses. So this, I'm sorry, I just get back. So so my vision is very poor, so okay, so the physical reality we perceive with our senses is actually a higher order reality than the. I'm having a hard time today. I don't know what it is.
That's okay. Take your time.
Anyway, so the basic principle is, I'll go back to the start of the principle. The basic principle is that consciousness is a higher order of reality than the physical creation we perceive with our senses. And this higher order reality is in the nature of consciousness. And its properties are that it is infinite awareness, infinite knowledge, and infinite intelligence. And it transcends time and space and causality, which is why I prefer to call it transcendent consciousness, even though there's many different names in different spiritual traditions. The other important aspect of this is that within each and every one of us, there is a drop of this infinite ocean of consciousness, which is made finite. That is our individual consciousness. And it is basically the same in essence as the transcendent consciousness, but it is finite. So the important thing to understand about these two principles is that they were discovered 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. And why are they relevant today? Well, the simple reason is that they were not discovered through logic or reasoning or deduction or observation of the physical. They were discovered through direct perception, which is achieved in the enlightened state, the state that Kundalini is trying to get us to. So that is why it is just as relevant today as it was 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. Okay, so next slide. So let's start with a simple definition of prana. And there's a dictionary, which is one of the two most valuable books on my bookshelf when it comes to interpreting the Indian tradition. This is Georg Fierstein's Dictionary, Encyclopedic Dictionary of Yoga, a wonderful book. I met Mr. Fierstein many years ago at one of our conferences. And in the book, he says that prana has two essential attributes. One of them is breath, and the other is life. Now, this may seem a bit simplistic or obvious because, obviously, if for some reason you can't breathe, you're going to find your life expectancy has been drastically shortened. However, there's a much deeper significance to this than the surface meanings. And this goes to one of the basic principles of the Indian tradition, which I found has been summed up actually in the best way by the ancient Hermetic saying, as above, so below. Meaning that what is an aspect of the macrocosm, the infinite, the transcendent, exists in a finite form in the microcosm, which is our physical body. And I've already given an illustration of that with consciousness. There's the Paramatma, the infinite transcendent consciousness, and there's the Jivatma, or the individual consciousness within each and every one of us. And so in order to really understand this, because obviously breath is the individual and life is the transcendent aspect. In order to understand this, you really need to have a good grasp of both of these ways of understanding prana. So what I'm going to do, say for the next 10 minutes or so, is to talk about the universal aspect. And then after that, I'll move on to the individual aspect and how it actually operates in the physical body in a Kundalini process. So next slide, please. Okay, so it really is not possible to understand the universal aspect of prana or kundalini either, unless you understand the process of creation as it is known in the Indian tradition. Now, in the West, creation is basically the Big Bang. 13.8 billion years ago, the entire universe just popped into existence from somewhere or somewhen. Science really doesn't know. Talk about a miracle. But that's the physical creation. In order to understand prana, we have to understand creation from the perspective of consciousness, the transcendent consciousness. Now, as I said a couple of minutes ago, consciousness, both the transcendent and the individual, have three characteristics: awareness, knowledge, and intelligence. But the transcendent consciousness has a fourth attribute, and this attribute might be described as the power to create finite realities within its own infinite nature. Lesser realities, but the finite realities. And the physical creation that we exist in, that we perceive with our senses, is actually one of these finite realities. And there may be other forms of reality with different laws of nature. Gopi Krishna speculated on that, and scientists talk about a multiverse of different things like that. So if this hermetic maximum, as above, so below, really is true, then we would expect to see a similar thing in our individual consciousness. And indeed we do. We do have the power to create a lesser form of reality than the one that we experience as waking consciousness. And that lesser form of reality is dreams. And when we're in the dream state, it seems completely and totally and absolutely real. We don't know that we're not in the dream state, but then we wake up, bingo, oh, that was just a construct of my mind, it has no reality other than that. Now, the transcendent consciousness, you might think of it as dreaming the physical creation in the same way that we create this lesser reality. The finite, the infinite transcendent consciousness creates this finite reality, which is the universe. But there is a bit of a difference here between the individual and the universal. In the individual, we cannot really control what we dream. They basically just happen to us. But at the transcendent level, because this consciousness is so much more powerful than our individual consciousness, it can make the dream be anything that it wants. So it creates the physical reality, and then it populates that physical reality with points of individual consciousness to experience that reality. So that's kind of like a general overview of how the Indian tradition understands creation. So on to the next slide.
Yeah, we're on the next slide.
Oh, okay. So the process of creation. Good. Okay. Now, what I'm going to do for the next few minutes is to talk about the process of creation in some of the different traditions of India. And this is not as straightforward as it may seem, because there's as many descriptions of this process as there are traditions. I mean, each one has their own different way of looking at it. And in Consciousness, the New Paradigm, which is the book I published about 8 years ago, I give a much more comprehensive description of this process for anyone who might be interested in a more detailed manner. And I'm going to take some of the basic ideas from two of the traditions of India, the Sankhya philosophy and the Tantric philosophy. Now, a moment ago, I said that the transcendent consciousness has the power to create a finite reality within itself. And in these traditions, the power to do this is called shakti. Shakti means creative power. And this whole process can actually get quite involved. In the Sankhya tradition, there are said to be 24 different levels or tattvas between pure consciousness and physical matter. And in the Tantric tradition, there's 36 levels. So this is way more than a poor little finite mind like mine can handle. So what I did in Consciousness, the New Paradigm, was I collapsed it down to a set of 5, what I call aspects of Shakti. And this is a lot more easy to digest and understand. So I'm just going to go through these 5 aspects one by one. Next slide. So this process of creation actually has something that's quite analogous in the modern world, and we've all pretty much experienced it. And that's when we go to a movie theater and watch a movie being displayed. And the way this works is you've got this projector at the back of the room, and within the projector is a brilliant white light bulb. Now, in the old days, it used to be, I don't know what their modern technology is, I'm sure it's very different, but in the old days, this brilliant white light used to be shone through a rapidly moving strip of colored celluloid film. And the resulting beams of light were shone on the screen at the front of the room, producing the images of the movie. So this projection is actually a three-stage process that's somewhat similar. So the first stage of the projection process in the Indian tradition is called Maya Shakti. And I'm sure you've all heard the term Maya, the veil of illusion. And I have to confess, it took me like 30 or 40 years before I really got a decent understanding or grasp of what that meant. Maya Shakti is that power which takes a drop of this ocean of transcendent consciousness and it finitizes it. I know that's not a word in the dictionary, but I like it anyway. It sounds cool to me. It makes this drop of this consciousness finite. And that's what Maya really means. That's what the actual meaning of the word is. So this speck of consciousness, which is our individual consciousness, of course, it's roughly analogous to the light bulb in the projector, because, of course, without the light bulb, you wouldn't have a movie. Without our individual consciousness, we wouldn't be able to perceive anything. So that's the first step. The second step is the creation of our mind, or the projection of our mind. And this is analogous to the moving strip of celluloid film in the projector. And in the Indian tradition, there are three aspects of mind that get created. There's the intellect, the ego, and the instinctive emotional mind, sort of rough translations into English of the Sanskrit terms. And that's the second stage. Now, the third stage, which is roughly analogous to the movie being shown on the white screen, is the projection of our physical body with its five senses, and then the creation that we perceive with those five senses. So that's the third step. Now, the obvious question is, why is it that we can't, we can't see this process of creation? And the simple answer is that our minds make it, like it's an aspect of our mind that makes this seem real. Now, when you're sitting in a movie theater watching a movie, are you really watching like characters and scenes, like locations and events going on? No, you're not. What you're actually watching is fluctuating patterns of colored light on a white screen. But your mind gives it a sense of reality. And I don't know about you, but when I think back on some of the things I watched in movie theaters, like the T-Rex chasing the Jeep with Jeff Goldblum in the back, or in the first Jurassic Park movie, or Gandalf battling the Balrog on the Bridge of Stone in Khazad-dûm in The Lord of the Rings. I was so engrossed in those things that I think World War III could have been going on outside the movie theater and I wouldn't have known it. It's just absolutely, our minds can become so concentrated. And this is the way it is. The only way that we can really perceive this projection process is in the state of enlightened consciousness. And in his autobiography, Gopi Krishna gives a beautiful description of this. And this is in 1949 when he was living in Jammu. Just at the time he transitioned into what I call the perennial state of consciousness. And he said, it was as if an image as vast as my conception of the cosmos were thrown out upon infinity by an infinitely small point. That's how he described it, really in a beautiful way. And this point is called Bindu in Sanskrit. And the dot of sandalwood paste that Hindus wear on their forehead is symbolic of this point from which the physical reality is projected. So that is the third stage of the projection process. Now, if that was all there was to the creation process, then all we would have would be a sea of dead and sentient matter, atoms and molecules bouncing off of each other. It is the last two stages or aspects of Shakti Kundalini Shakti and Prana Shakti, which are responsible for life. Without those two, there would be no life. Now, what is the difference? Next slide, or is it on there yet? Yeah, there we go. What is the difference between Kundalini Shakti and Prana Shakti? Well, the difference is actually quite simple. Prana Shakti is responsible for the maintenance of our body. And that means overall systems in the body like digestion, assimilation, respiration, elimination, the endocrine system, the immune system, all the way down to what goes on in each and every individual cell in like 20 to 50 trillion of them in our body. And Prana Shakti is so intelligent, as if the nature of transcendent consciousness. It's infinitely knowing. It knows what's going on in every single one of the cells of your body. And it is that intelligent. Now, what is the difference between Prana Shakti and Kundalini Shakti? Kundalini Shakti has two modes of function. The first mode is what you would call creation. And Kundalini Shakti starts at the moment that we're a fertilized ovum in the womb of our mother. And it goes on for 9 months. A single fertilized cell divides and grows and eventually becomes a living, thinking, breathing human being consisting of about 1 trillion cells of several hundred different types, creating a construct which is self-maintaining, it is self-repairing and self-replicating, at least with the help of one other individual. This is a feat of creative intelligence, which makes anything devised by the ingenuity of humankind pale into almost utter insignificance. It is so complex, so versatile. Really, it's a miracle. You know, a baby is a miracle. This is Kundalini in its creation stage. Now, on the day that we're born, and more specifically, at the moment we start to breathe, remember breathing is one of the definitions of prana. At the moment we begin to breathe, Prana Shakti takes over from Kundalini Shakti and maintains the body from that point. Now, I have to make it clear, these are not two separate, distinct entities. It's kind of like if you have an artist and the artist sits down one day and paints a portrait of somebody. And then the next day they sit down with a hammer and chisel and a block of marble and they carve out a statue of that same person. It's the same artist doing the same, creating a similar thing, but using different ways of doing it. So this is Prana Shakti and Kundalini Shakti, really all just aspects of Shakti, but with different functions. So the first aspect of Shakti is this creation process, which brings us into being when we come out squalling into the world. Now, later on in life, depending on a number of factors, such as our heredity, our spiritual practices, our lifestyle, our mental attitude, our health, Kundalini may become active again. But instead of being the creation process, this is the evolutionary process. And what it attempts to do, and I really heavily emphasize attempts to do, is to rebuild the brain and nervous system, and according to Gopi Krishna, the internal organs of the body, so that the body can manifest enlightened consciousness, this new faculty of perception. So this is really the two operative modes of Kundalini Shakti. Now, both of these things, Prana Shakti and Kundalini Shakti, being aspects of Shakti, are of the nature of pure consciousness, intelligence. They have no physical component whatsoever. So how is it that they can affect life? How can they affect the physical creation to bring life into being and maintain it? Well, the simple answer is the individual prana. So if you want to go on to the next slide, Gopi Krishna had a slightly different name for the individual prana. He called it the pranic spectrum. And he said that there was a pranic spectrum for each species of life on Earth, and there was a subset of that pranic spectrum for each individual of each species of life on Earth. And so he described this pranic spectrum as being an extremely subtle biochemical medium, as yet undiscovered by science since it is so subtle, which is responsible for all facets of life, including the activity of thought and the transference of sensation in living organisms. So what I've been able to do from all these years of study of what he said about the pranic spectrum is I've been able to put down 3 functional modes of this pranic spectrum. Now, I could easily spend an hour's presentation on each one of these, so I'm just going to give you a very bare bones summary of what they're about. Now, the first mode of operation is as an information storage medium. So what information does it store? Well, at the level of the species, it stores information such as the form and shape of the human body and assembly instructions for complex organs like the eye or the liver or other things. Information which, by the way, science has not been able to find in our DNA, although they don't like to generally let it be known. I call it one of the best kept secrets in science. Another thing which is an aspect at the species level is instinctive behavior. And instinct is another thing. Science has given us this nice little label. Oh, it's just instinct. But if you ask them, well, how does it work? Well, it must be genetic. But then you say, well, how does information in a gene translate into behavior patterns in the brain of a particular member of a species? They have no idea. They just assume, since the only information storage in the body, the system they know of in the body is DNA, it's got to be in there somewhere. Another thing is the hive mind of insects like ants and termites, which is incredibly capable and complex. So these things, again, science has no explanation for. Now, the second functional aspect of prana is as a communications medium. So what can we attribute that to? Well, for one thing, psychic phenomena. So we have clairvoyance, clairaudience, clairsentience, telepathy, remote viewing. These are all things which science has no explanation for. But if you assume that the pranic spectrum is something which links up all life, then it makes sense. Another thing that would be responsible for is Rupert Sheldrake's 100th monkey principle, where the more members of a species that are taught a particular learning behavior, the faster it will be for the remaining members of that species to learn it. And he has shown this time and time and time again in experiments. So this is a consequence of the communications aspect of the pranic spectrum. Now, the third aspect, which is what I'm going to focus on for the rest of today, is this function as an energy storage and transmission medium. And this is what is active in the individual aspect of the Kundalini process. So to go on to the next slide, this is to show you that I'm not cooking this all up in my head. These are the 5 functional aspects of prana shakti as elucidated in the Indian tradition. So we have prana itself, which is responsible for respiration in the upper trunk of the body. We have samana, responsible for digestion and assimilation in the middle trunk of the body. And we have apana, which is the downward prana in the lower trunk of the body, which is responsible for elimination. And then we have udana, which is the upward prana in the neck and head, which is responsible for speech and ideation. And then vyana, which is called the diffuse prana, which I would interpret in a modern sense as cellular function. Now, you have to keep in mind that these definitions were from a time when there was no detailed knowledge of anatomy and physiology. So these adepts could see these things happening in their body, that this prana was doing these things, but that's the best explanation that they could have. Well, it's associated with digestion in this part of the body or whatever. So hopefully in the coming years, science will be able to shed much more light on this aspect of the of prana shakti. So next slide, please. So to go on to the individual prana in Kundalini Shakti, which is the Kundalini process. I'm going to skip over the gestation because there really isn't a lot of information about that. Gopi Krishna, being a male, had no direct experience of this, and he never talked about any references to it in the writings of the Indian tradition. Not to mean that those references may not have been there, but I think the tradition was mostly written by males, and it was highly allegorical and not easy to interpret. So hopefully in the not too distant future, we will have more females who will be born and have this transformation go on to the degree where they'll be able to perceive what is happening in their womb during the gestation process. So the evolutionary process, a Kundalini process, how does this actually work in the physical body? So pranic energy. What is pranic energy? Now, everyone who has had taken an interest in yoga will know what pranayama is. It is the exercise by which prana is absorbed into the body through the breath. And that absorption is enhanced with pranayama exercises. So what is it that we're actually bringing into the body? Well, air consists of two basic elements. It's about, I think, 83% nitrogen, and I think 16% oxygen, and 1% other gases. Now, nitrogen is extremely stable and highly unreactive. Nitrogen atoms like to bind very tightly with each other, but not with other elements. So essentially, it's inert. We breathe it into our lungs, we breathe it out. It doesn't really get absorbed into the body in any degree. Oxygen, however, is another matter altogether. It is highly reactive and is, in fact, an extremely good catalyst, enabling other reactions. And in his autobiography, Living with Kundalini, Gopi Krishna expressed the opinion that prana was actually associated in some way with the oxygen atom. He thought maybe in one unpublished private interview, he said possibly it is some kind of as yet undetected subatomic particle which attaches itself to the oxygen atom. We really don't know, but in some way it's associated with oxygen. So when we breathe in, oxygen is carried to every one of the living cells in our body. And we know this because individual cells are like our whole body. If they don't get fresh oxygen on a regular basis, they'll die. So oxygen is brought into the cells. And when it gets into the cells, it seems that this pranic energy is stripped off of the oxygen atoms and is stored in what I would call a pranic essence. Again, a very subtle essence that science has not yet discovered. And in Kundalini, the Dawn of a New Science, Gopi Krishna said that every cell of the body is like a pranic battery being charged up with this energy. And as more oxygen atoms come into the cell, then it keeps the cell charged over and over again with this pranic energy. Now, the next stage of this process is where this pranic essence is collected by the nerves, and it is taken to two separate destinations in the body. So next slide, please. So the first destination where the smaller amount of prana goes is directly to the brain. And Gopi Krishna, as I said earlier, he defined the pranic spectrum as a medium for the activity of thought. So I think it might be a little too extreme to say that we wouldn't be able to think without prana, but I think maybe it has something to do with higher order functions of thought that human beings can manifest, but other animals don't seem to be able to, like understanding mathematics or, planning and logic, reasoning, deduction, inference, and those kind of things. So it maybe has something to do with those higher order functionings of our brain. The second point that he made about the prana going to the brain was that it was taken there by a very limited set of nerves. And my personal speculation is that it's the cranial nerves that do this, because there are 12 pairs of cranial nerves going directly into the brain, coming from organs like the eyes, ears, mouth, tongue, and they don't go through the spinal cord. They go directly into the brain. But that's just my speculation. So that is the role of the pranic essence going to the brain. Next slide, please. So the bulk of the pranic essence that is collected from the cells of the body by the nervous system is taken to the reproductive organs. And it is stored there in the fluids of the reproductive system, I guess you could say. These fluids contain the most potent form of prana in the body. And obviously, males and females have a somewhat different chemistry in their reproductive fluids. But Gopi Krishna emphasized that what happens in this way, these things I'm going to describe in a minute, it's a parallel process, that there is not that something happens in one and not the other. It happens in a different way in males and females, but it functionally achieves the same goals. Now, there are two purposes for which this pranic essence in the reproductive organs can be used. One is for sex and procreation. And it is actually this pranic essence which is responsible for the exquisite pleasure we get from sexual arousal and orgasm. Without the pranic essence, they just wouldn't happen. And in one private interview, Gopi Krishna said that this pranic essence is actually necessary for insemination, as well as the sexual arousal. So that is the first way in which this pranic essence in the reproductive organs is used. Now, the second way that it can be used is for spiritual transformation. So if you want to go on to the next slide. When somebody says to me that they're going through an intense Kundalini process, or when somebody makes that statement generally, I think what most people think about is what's going on at the base of the spine. They think of this energy zooming up. But this is really a misconception about Kundalini. The term, the awakening of Kundalini, what it refers to is the activation of an area in the brain which is relatively dormant in individuals in a normal state of consciousness. But when somebody says to me, oh, I'm going through a really, intense Kundalini process, I'm thinking, what's happening in their brain? Because if you think about it, meditation is the exercise which is primarily used to awaken Kundalini. And what is meditation? It's an exercise of the brain. So what happens is this little area in the brain, and Gopi Krishna described it, he said it's about 2 inches above the palate or the roof of the mouth and below the crown of the head, slightly back towards the back of the head. He said something about the fourth ventricle, but I don't know enough about anatomy to say what the fourth ventricle is. So it is this region of the brain which becomes active as a consequence of, meditation or concentration. Even concentration on mundane objects like a spreadsheet can trigger this to happen, which is why Kundalini seems to be happening more and more in the modern world. So when this center becomes active in a major way, what you end up with is a genuine mystical experience where the person has this new faculty of perception active in them. And pretty much it only happens for a few moments, maybe a few hours if the person is really lucky. But what happens is when this center of the brain becomes active, it instantaneously needs a higher quantity and quality of this pranic essence to fuel this, what's going on. And it's a bit like if you take a 100-watt light bulb out of a light and you plug in a 200-watt light bulb, you'll get a lot more luminescence. But that light bulb will draw double the amount of current from the electrical grid. So it's the same way when the center of the brain becomes active. What it does is it sends a signal or signals down to the reproductive organs and the center at the base of the spine, saying, start sending pranic fuel up the spinal cord. So the Kundalini process starts in the brain. So what happens is the center at the base of the spine somehow takes this pranic essence from the fluids of the reproductive organs, it sublimates it into a more refined form, and it sends it up the spinal cord to the brain. Now, this is a very simplified explanation. In fact, there is more than one thing that gets sent up the spinal cord. It can go up through other nerves, so it's not just as simple as what I'm saying. But for the purpose of this explanation, it is roughly the way things happen. That this refined pranic essence, which in Sanskrit is called ojas, O-J-A-S, is sent up the spinal cord to fuel this center in the brain. So next slide, please. So ideally what happens over time, because obviously the reproductive organs cannot provide this essence indefinitely. Over time, what will happen if the center of the brain stays open is that Kundalini Shakti will rebuild the brain, the nervous system, and the internal organs so that a much greater quantity of this pranic fuel can be supplied to the brain directly from the nervous system without going through the reproductive organs. And in Gopi Krishna's case, this took 12 years. He said he would wake up in the middle of the night and it would be like a storm of activity going on inside his body. He said he felt like an individual tied to a raft going down a raging river, utterly helpless to do anything but watch this going on in his body. So ideally, if the process goes to completion, which is extremely rare, then you will have a situation like he had where the body can provide this pranic essence or pranic fuel to the brain directly, and the drain on the reproductive system will decrease. And this is why just about every spiritual tradition will advise celibacy during an intense process of spiritual transformation. It's not that sex is unclean or that it's evil or anything like that. It's simply because it will deprive the brain of this pranic fuel that it needs to function at this higher level. And I've talked to many people over the years who have experienced this directly. I was speaking to one fellow I've known for many years a couple of weeks ago, and he was very blunt about it. He said, I cannot even masturbate without having a terrible thing, this awful depression coming in on my brain. He said, when I deprive my brain of this energy. So this is something that this happens in women as well. Gopi Krishna talked about one woman who came to him, and he said to us that when she first came to him, she was very embarrassed to talk about what had happened to her. And he said, now look, you have to tell me exactly what happened to you. And she said, oh, okay, well, and then she started to talk about how her sex drive had gone into overdrive to produce this, this pranic fuel. And at the end, she said, is this the way to God? And he says, absolutely. And she just had a hard time accepting this. And many people who have Kundalini active, they have things going on with the reproductive organs. And on the Batcat presentation, I talked at length to Rick Archer about this, like the spiritual teachers who go off the rails and then start having sex with their female disciples. And they may be decent people who have no desire to do anything wrong, but because they're meditating intently, they're doing pranayama exercises, the center in the brain stimulates the reproductive system and it just goes into overdrive, and they don't have the training or the self-discipline to handle it. And so I said to Rick, I said, we shouldn't just label these people as being leches or anything like that. What we need is a framework of understanding for these people and their students to know that this can happen, and safeguards put in place to make sure that if it does happen, there's ways that it can be handled without adverse effect to either the teacher or the disciple. So understanding how the reproductive organs work, what's going on in the brain, it's absolutely essential to understand Kundalini. For instance, if you have a situation where for some reason the center at the base of the spine becomes active and starts sending energy up the spine to the brain, but nothing happens in the brain, well, you're going to get sensations of orgasm up and down the spinal cord, but not much else. On the other hand, if you have the situation where the center of the brain becomes active, but for whatever reason, it cannot send the energy up the spine to the brain, and some of those reasons I'll talk about in a few moments, then you can have terrible mental distress. A person can end up, I met one fellow, I talked about him on the Batcat presentation, this fellow who ended up in an insane asylum in India, a very professional man. And Gopi Krishna got him back to full health, but, he had this massive, when he said when he was going through this terrible time in the mental hospital, he said he would have a dozen full orgasms a night. And this is, to me, when I heard this, I thought, well, why did this happen? And then I suddenly realized that when this guy told us about his lifestyle, he had been smoking, drinking heavily, had a terrible diet, poor sleep, insufficient exercise. And what happened was the prana in his body had become so toxic that if it had been sent up the spine to the brain, even in a sublimated form, probably would have driven him completely insane, or even worse. So it's really essential to understand this whole functioning of the brain, the reproductive organs, and what's going on in the relationship between them, in order to understand, when people come and say, look, I've got this Kundalini problem, you have a better understanding of why they're having this problem. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is essentially that, why so many people have difficulties with Kundalini. And this speaks to how inimical our modern Western lifestyle is to the Kundalini process. So if you want to go on to the last screen, you're on there. Okay. So the toxification of the prana. So this list of things that will toxify the prana, it's almost like a description of the lifestyle of a major percentage of the population. Smoking is one of the worst ones. It really badly toxifies the prana. Probably vaping as well, though maybe not to such a great extent. But I would say absolutely you should not be vaping if you're going through a spiritual transformation. Alcohol and recreational drugs, toxify the prana. Poor quality food that is high in fats and sugars and low in fats and sugars and chemical additives and low in fiber and nutrition, like translate that as ultra processed food, which is what you see in most of the shelves of the grocery store outside of the fruit and vegetable section. Then there is insufficient sleep. Gopi Krishna said, if you're going through a Kundalini transformation, you want to get at least 10 hours of sleep a day. And there is insufficient exercise or inappropriate exercise. He said, it's better to get light exercise than it is to be able to bench press 200 kilos. You don't want to build up massive muscles. You want to have you want to build up your cardiovascular system. So light exercise is better. And finally, last but not least, is the mental attitude. And one thing that can toxify the prana is extreme negative emotions. Emotions such as hatred or prejudice or covetousness, jealousy, rage, as well as excessive desire. And I emphasize excessive desire for wealth, because we all need enough wealth to live comfortably. Excessive desire for wealth. And here I'm talking about people who all they think about is making more money. And it doesn't matter how much they make, it's never enough. All they want is more money, the bigger car, the bigger house, the latest gadgets. That's all they can think about. So excessive desire for wealth, for power over other people, and we've seen examples of that recently, and excessive desire for fame, which, we see too often in the news these days. So these things all have this effect of toxifying the prana. On the other hand, it goes both ways. If you turn your thoughts to spiritual objectives, reverence for the divine, reduction of your ego, honesty, charitable, all the things that the basic tenets of all the religious traditions, these are the things which will purify the prana and enhance the Kundalini process. And hopefully, as this knowledge becomes more better known, over the next decades and centuries, that the human race will eventually learn how Kundalini works. And the phenomenon will happen in a better way in more people. And eventually we'll reach the stage where this higher consciousness becomes a faculty of perception of the whole race. So I guess I better stop there. I hope that gives you a better understanding of Kundalini, what it is, how it works. of the individual prana and the universal prana, universal Kundalini, because these are all things that really you can't understand Kundalini without all these different things. And I hope that what I've said today will be helpful to you and to the people who watch this video in the future when it's posted. And I'm looking forward to any of your questions.